At some point in your life, you asked a question that no one could fully answer. Why is this happening to me? Maybe it was a diagnosis you did not expect, a relationship that collapsed without warning, a loss that left a silence in your life that nothing has been able to fill. Maybe it was smaller than that, the slow accumulation of disappointments, the gap between the life you imagined and the life you are actually living, the feeling that you are carrying something heavy and nobody around you seems to understand the weight of it. Whatever it was, you asked the question, and the question itself is important, because how you answer it, or whether you can answer it at all, will shape everything about how you carry what you carry. And here is what makes this so difficult. Psychology, philosophy, and faith have each been trying to answer that question for centuries, and none of them fully satisfies. Psychology wants to eliminate suffering. Philosophy wants to accept it. Faith wants to redeem it. And the honest truth is that none of those answers, taken alone, is enough. That tension is not a failure of human thought. It is a window into something true about the nature of suffering itself. And that is exactly what this video is about. Before we go further, if this is the kind of content that speaks to something real in you, content that takes psychology, philosophy, and faith seriously without pretending they all agree, subscribe to this channel now, because this is exactly what we explore here. Not shallow answers, but the honest tension between the deepest traditions of human thought. Modern psychology looks at suffering and sees a problem to be solved. And to be fair, that instinct has produced extraordinary results. The development of psychotherapy, behavioral science, neuroscience, has given millions of people genuine relief from depression, anxiety, trauma, forms of suffering that previous generations had no language for and no tools to address. Psychology deserves enormous credit for that. But the foundational assumption beneath most of modern psychology is this: suffering is a dysfunction. It is something that is happening to you that should not be happening. And the goal of treatment is to return you to a state where the suffering is gone. Freud saw it clearly. He argued that human beings are fundamentally driven by the pleasure principle, the unconscious drive to avoid pain and maximize pleasure, and that the entire architecture of modern civilization is essentially one long elaborate strategy for managing that drive. We build structures, social rules, cultural narratives, all in service of making the unbearable more bearable. And behavioral science goes even further. It shows us that suffering is not just emotional, it is verbal. It is the stories we tell about our pain that amplify or diminish it. A child who loses a pet suffers, but a child who has been taught that losing a pet means losing a member of the family, who has learned to project human grief onto animal death, suffers in a categorically different and more complex way, because language transforms raw pain into meaning, and meaning can either deepen or dissolve suffering depending on how it is constructed. This is a profound insight. The ACT framework that emerged from behavioral science makes the radical suggestion that much of our suffering is not caused by the painful events themselves, but by our desperate attempts to avoid feeling them. That the more energy we spend trying not to feel what we feel, the more power those feelings gain over us. And that the path through suffering often requires something counterintuitive. Not elimination, but acceptance. But here is where psychology reaches a limit. It does not always name. It can tell you how to reduce suffering, how to reframe it, how to carry it more skillfully. But it struggles to tell you why. It cannot tell you whether your suffering has meaning, whether it is pointing somewhere, whether there is something on the other side of it worth the cost of going through it. And for most people who are truly suffering, that question is not academic. It is the question that determines whether they can get up in the morning. Philosophy looks at suffering and refuses to treat it only as a problem. The Stoics were among the first to make this argument with force. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. that most of what torments us is not the present moment of pain, but the anticipation of pain, the memory of pain, the narrative we construct around pain that makes it larger and more permanent than it actually is. And the Stoic prescription was radical, not to eliminate suffering, but to change your relationship to it, to recognize that the only things truly within your control are your judgments and your responses, and that suffering which comes from clinging to what you cannot control is self-inflicted. That is not cold advice. It is deeply liberating advice. If you can genuinely internalize the Stoic distinction between what is in your power and what is not, an enormous amount of suffering simply dissolves, because you stop fighting reality. You stop demanding that the world be other than it is. And in that acceptance, something like peace becomes possible. But Nietzsche took this in a completely different direction. And the difference matters. Nietzsche did not want you to accept suffering. He wanted you to be transformed by it. His famous phrase, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," is not a cheerful motivational slogan. It is a philosophical claim about the relationship between suffering and growth. Nietzsche believed that the avoidance of suffering produces weakness, that a life organized around comfort and security gradually hollows a person out, and that genuine strength, genuine depth of character, is only forged through contact with what is hard and painful and real. And Viktor Frankl, writing from inside a Nazi concentration camp, arrived at perhaps the most devastating version of this insight. He observed that the prisoners who survived were not necessarily the physically strongest. They were the ones who found meaning in their suffering. Who could answer the question, "Why am I enduring this?" And his conclusion was not that suffering is good, but that suffering without meaning is the most destructive force a human being can face. While suffering held within a meaningful framework, however painful, can be survived, and sometimes even transforms the person who survives it. Philosophy offers something psychology tends to undervalue: the possibility that suffering is not an error in the system, but data about the nature of reality, a signal that something real is at stake, that you are alive enough to be hurt by things that matter. But philosophy also leaves something unanswered. It can tell you to accept suffering, or to be transformed by it, but it cannot guarantee that the transformation will come. It cannot tell you what is waiting on the other side. And for a person in the darkest moments of genuine suffering, the possibility of transformation is not always enough. Sometimes what a person needs is not a framework, but a presence, not an idea, but a promise. And that is exactly what faith offers. Faith looks at suffering and says something that neither psychology nor philosophy is willing to say directly. It says that suffering is not wasted. The Christian tradition in particular holds that suffering is not a sign of God's absence, but the specific terrain where the deepest encounter with God becomes possible. The letter of Paul to the Romans does not say that suffering is pleasant or that it should be sought for its own sake. It says that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. There is a sequence there, a direction, a suggestion that what looks like destruction from the inside is actually formation. And the image of Job is one of the most honest portrayals of suffering in any tradition. Job does not suffer quietly or obediently. He argues with God. He demands an accounting. He refuses to accept the explanations his friends offer. And the text does not condemn him for that. It vindicates him, because the honest cry of a person in genuine pain is not a failure of faith. It is faith itself, the refusal to pretend that what hurts does not hurt, the insistence on bringing the full weight of human experience into the presence of God, rather than sanitizing it first. The grain of wheat parable captures something essential about the Christian understanding of suffering. The grain does not understand why it must go into the ground, why it must break open and lose the form it had. But the breaking is not destruction. It is the condition of everything that comes after. And what comes after is more than what went in. But faith also has to sit. honestly with something that psychology and philosophy do not fully face, because the research on religion and suffering shows something complex. For many people, faith provides genuine sustenance in suffering, a sense of not being alone, a framework that holds the pain within something larger than the pain itself. But religious frameworks can also intensify suffering. When people interpret their pain as divine punishment, when they feel guilty for suffering as if it indicates a failure of faith, when the religious community around them treats their suffering as evidence of insufficient belief, the suffering becomes compound. The pain of what happened, plus the shame of not recovering from it properly, and the gap between what faith declares and what a person in suffering actually experiences is one of the most painful realities in the life of belief. The theology says you are not alone. The experience says you have never felt more alone. The tradition says this suffering has meaning. The 3 a.m. in the darkness says, meaning feels very far away right now. And faith that cannot hold that gap honestly, that insists the gap should not exist, does more damage than comfort. So here is what each tradition offers, and where each one falls short. Psychology gives you tools, real tools, for carrying suffering more skillfully, for understanding how your relationship to pain can either deepen it or diminish it, for recognizing when suffering has become pathological and needs professional intervention. This matters enormously and should not be dismissed. But psychology alone tends to treat suffering as a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be lived. And that framing, however well-intentioned, can leave a person feeling that their inability to eliminate the suffering is itself a failure. Philosophy gives you perspective. The Stoic reminder that most suffering is amplified by the stories we tell about it is genuinely liberating. The Nietzschean insistence that difficulty forges rather than destroys is genuinely empowering. Satisfies. Frankl's discovery that meaning transforms the experience of suffering is one of the most important psychological insights of the 20th century. But philosophy gives you frameworks without guarantees. It tells you how to think about suffering without being able to promise that the thinking will be enough. Faith gives you something neither psychology nor philosophy can offer. The possibility that your suffering is held within a story larger than your own, that it is not random, that it is not wasted, that the grain of wheat going into the ground is not the end of the story. But faith carries a danger that the other 2 traditions do not. The danger of using theological language to bypass the actual experience of pain, of rushing to the resurrection without sitting honestly in the darkness of the tomb, of telling someone that God has a plan in a way that shuts down rather than opens up their grief. What all 3 traditions are circling, without any of them fully landing on it, is something simpler and harder than any of their frameworks. Suffering is real. It is not a malfunction. It is not a failure. It is not evidence of weakness or insufficient faith or poor thinking. It is part of what it means to be a human being who is alive enough to love things that can be lost. And the person who is suffering most needs not to be fixed, but to be accompanied, to have someone or something willing to sit in the darkness with them without rushing them toward the light. Psychology at its best does this. Philosophy at its best does this. Faith at its best does this. And the person who can draw on all 3, who can use psychological tools without reducing suffering to a malfunction, who can find philosophical meaning without bypassing the reality of the pain, who can hold on to faith without using it to silence the honest cry of a broken heart. That person has something rare, not an answer to the question why, but the capacity to live the question with integrity. So the next time suffering finds you, and it will, because it finds everyone, do not rush to explain it away. Do not immediately reach for the framework that makes it smaller than it is. Let it be what it is for a moment. Let yourself be a person who is genuinely in pain without apologizing for that, or trying to fix it before you have fully felt it. And then, when you are ready, bring all three traditions to bear. Ask what psychology can teach you about how you are relating to this pain. Ask what philosophy can teach you about what meaning might be present in it. Ask what faith offers you about where this suffering might be leading. Not because any of those questions will make the pain disappear, but because a suffering that is examined is different from a suffering that is merely endured. Because meaning does not eliminate pain, but it changes what pain can do to you. Frankl said it better than anyone. Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. Not because the how becomes easy, but because the why is strong enough to hold it. And maybe that is the most honest thing that can be said about suffering. None of the traditions fully answers the question, why is this happening to me? But together, they point toward something more important than an answer. They point toward a posture, the posture of a person who does not let suffering be the last word, who carries it with honesty and courage, and the stubborn belief that what breaks us open does not have to define us. It can also be the beginning of something we could not have become any other way. If this video spoke to something real in you, if you are looking for content that takes these questions seriously, that refuses to give easy answers to hard questions, that holds psychology, philosophy, and faith in honest conversation with each other, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Because every week we go deeper into the questions that matter most. The questions about suffering, guilt, pride, identity, meaning, and the hidden tensions between what science, philosophy, and faith each see about what it means to be human. This is not motivational content. This is the kind of wisdom that changes how you see yourself. If that is what you are looking for, you are in the right place. Subscribe now, and we will see you in the next one.